Welcome to This Explainer. You know, you are alive right now, sitting here, watching this, in large part because your ancestors were surprisingly good at not dying from injuries that absolutely should have killed them. Today, we're turning back the clock. We're going to look at the ancient world not as some primitive era, but as a high-stakes survival scenario. It's basically where medical history turns into a fascinating scientific detective story, a look at how human intelligence operated brilliantly, totally without the theoretical frameworks that we rely on today.
To understand just how remarkable our ancestors were, we really have to establish the stakes here. Imagine a world where a simple paper cut could literally be a guaranteed death sentence. For most of human prehistory, we had no antibiotics, no sterile dressings, and definitely no emergency rooms. The most dangerous part of an ancient wound wasn't actually the wound itself, it was what came after. Sure, you could survive a brutal lion attack, but that meant absolutely nothing if you died 2 weeks later from a bacterial infection you couldn't even see. That was the lethal, delayed trap of the ancient world.
Which brings us to Chapter 1, The Invisible Enemy.
Okay, let's dive into this. How did early humans successfully fight off and manage complex bacterial infections, sepsis, and gangrene without having any concept of what a germ actually was? I mean, they didn't know what bacteria were or what an infection was in any sort of mechanistic sense, but they could see the results. They observed what worked. And the timeline of this medical ingenuity pushes back much, much further than most people realize. We aren't just talking about a few thousand years ago. No way. We're looking at evidence of medicinal plant use by Neanderthals 60,000 years ago, complex surgical amputations 31,000 years ago, and structured clinical trauma texts from 3,000 years ago. It's mind-blowing.
Moving on to Chapter 2, Nature's First Aid Kit.
To really grasp the origins of medicine, we have to realize that using the environment as a medicine cabinet is an ancient instinct. It's inherited from our deepest evolutionary past, completely predating modern humanity itself. Just look at the behaviors we see in modern primates. Chimpanzees have been filmed actively self-medicating. When they're infected with intestinal parasites, they specifically seek out and consume the leaves of the Vernonia amygdalina plant. This is a plant with zero nutritional value, but it has documented antiparasitic properties. They even apply chewed plant material directly to wounds. And we see this exact same instinct 60,000 years ago with Neanderthals at the Shanidar cave site in Iraq. Researchers found pollen from plants like yarrow and ephedra directly next to a burial site. These are plants with genuine, documented medicinal properties.
So imagine having a severe, bleeding wound and packing it with dense spiderwebs or thick, sticky honey. I know it sounds like total folk superstition, right? But pure empirical observation led our ancestors to genuine biochemical solutions. Take spider silk. It's naturally rich in vitamin K, which directly aids in blood clotting, and it's antimicrobial. Honey creates a hyperosmotic environment that literally draws water out of bacterial cells to kill them, all while producing hydrogen peroxide as a byproduct. Yarrow, which legend says Achilles used on his soldiers at Troy, actually has proven hemostatic properties. They had no idea about the biochemistry, but they knew for sure that it worked. That takes us to Chapter 3, Ancient Surgical Miracles.
Now, we're shifting from basic natural first aid to deliberate, highly complex surgical interventions. And keep in mind, these were performed with nothing but sharpened stones. In a cave on the Indonesian island of Borneo, researchers found a skeleton dating back at least 31,000 years. The visceral, shocking reality of this discovery is that the individual's lower left leg had been cleanly amputated. It wasn't torn off by an animal or crushed in an accident. No. It was surgically removed with a sharp stone tool by someone who clearly understood human anatomy and knew exactly where to cut to prevent fatal blood loss. And the most staggering part? The bone shows clear evidence of healing. That means this patient survived the surgery and lived for years afterward.
And amputations weren't the only major procedures. We also have trepanation, the deliberate surgical drilling or scraping of holes into the human skull. This is actually the most widespread ancient surgical procedure documented. It's been found on every inhabited continent and dates back over 7,000 years. It was likely a blend of ancient medical intervention, maybe an attempt to relieve intracranial pressure from a severe skull fracture or bleeding, and spiritual ritual, basically creating an opening for spirits to enter or exit, essentially giving your demons some literal fresh air. But whatever their reasoning was, you just cannot argue with the results. The survival rate for ancient skull trepanations at some sites is estimated to be over 50%. We know this for a fact because the skulls show healed bone growth around the openings. Doing this without sterile conditions, without modern anatomy, and having half the patients survive, that proves this was genuine, developing competence. It wasn't just occasional luck.
Here we are at Chapter 4, Managing Pain and Cleanliness, which naturally brings up a crucial question. How do you perform brutal surgery with stone tools on a conscious human without anesthesia?
Well, the answer is they didn't.
Now, what's really interesting about this is that ancient healers absolutely did possess a deliberate toolkit of consciousness-altering anesthetics. They weren't just hacking away at fully alert patients. They used willow bark, which contains salicin, that's the exact precursor to salicylic acid, or what we call modern aspirin. They used mandrake root, which contains scopolamine for its genuine sedative effects. Opium and cannabis regularly appear in ancient Egyptian, Sumerian, and Chinese medical texts. They were actively and intentionally managing the pain problem.
Beyond pain, they had to manage cleanliness. They practiced wound irrigation, flushing out debris with very specific liquids. They used water, sure, but they also used wine, vinegar, and even fresh urine. And, okay, before you cringe, urine is actually sterile when it's fresh. By applying these specific liquids, they created environments that were incredibly hostile to bacterial growth. Flushing a wound with wine introduces alcohol. Vinegar introduces high acidity. Again, they couldn't articulate the complex chemistry behind it, but it's an absolute masterclass in brilliant empirical observation.
And all of this highly specialized knowledge regarding pain and cleanliness wasn't just random guesswork floating around out there. It was carefully held by shamans and specialized practitioners, passed down systematically from master to apprentice, and eventually it was codified into structured medical texts. Take the Edwin Smith Papyrus from ancient Egypt, dating to around 1600 BCE. It is essentially a medical textbook. It describes 48 surgical trauma cases with incredible clinical detail, diagnoses, treatability assessments, and follow-up observations that a modern trauma surgeon would instantly recognize today.
Which brings us to Chapter 5, The Empirical Legacy. So as we bring this narrative home, the crucial point is to recognize that this ancient observational science laid the exact, unbroken foundation for the modern emergency rooms we rely on to keep us alive today. Modern medicine did not replace ancient wound treatment. It simply provided the mechanistic explanations, the why, for what our ancestors had already figured out through thousands of years of trial and error. Think about this loop. They observed outcomes, retained what worked, like honey and willow bark, quietly discarded the failures, and accumulated this life-saving working knowledge across generations.
And this brilliantly illustrates an incredible realization. They were fighting bacteria without knowing bacteria existed. They managed a profound, fundamentally human cognitive achievement. They got the right answers without having the right explanations. Sure, they lacked the microscopes and the whole concept of germ theory, but the sheer attention to detail allowed them to win the fight against infection often enough to keep our species alive.
But there's one final piece of the puzzle here that we absolutely cannot ignore: the power of social support. Think back to that 31,000-year-old Borneo amputee. That individual did not survive just because the surgery was clean. They survived because their community fed them, protected them, and cared for them for years while they were vulnerable. Social care and community support have always been, and definitely still remain, a vital, deeply embedded medical intervention. Humans are social animals, and keeping each other alive is just what we do.
As we wrap up, I want to leave you pondering this. You are the endpoint of a long, unbroken chain of empirical survival running from a prehistoric cave directly to your modern life. Every treatment that worked, every healer who taught an apprentice, pushed the system forward so that you could be here today. So, looking ahead, who is going to inherit our current medical knowledge in another 31,000 years? What will they think of our practices today? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Stay curious, and I'll catch you next time.